We are very fortunate to have with us today three very distinguished speakers. We have Professor Abdullah from Temple University. He's associate professor in the religion department and a faculty affiliate in the Department of Geography and Urban Studies, holding a doctorate in cultural anthropology. His work focuses on the interplay between race, religion, and ethnicity. He has earned many awards, including from the Smithsonian Institution's Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, the National Museum of African Art, the Social Science Research Council, and the Ford Foundation. He's also the author of Black Mecca, the African Muslims of Harlem, and he works as a community imam, Muslim prison chaplain, Islamic studies scholar, and culture consultant, curator, and programming organizer. So welcome, Professor Abdullah. We also have with us today the Reverend Dr. David Grafton, who is Professor of Islamic Studies and Christian-Muslim Relations on the faculty of the Duncan Black McDonald Center for the Study of Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations at Hartford Seminary. He holds a PhD in Islamic Studies and an MDiv from Luther Seminary, and is also an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. He has served Lutheran congregations in New Jersey, England, and Cairo, Egypt, where he also served as the coordinator of graduate studies and director of the Center for Middle East Christianity at the Evangelical Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and has been an adjunct lecturer in Islamic studies at the Dar-Kamboni Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies. Among his many publications, the most recent is An American Biblical Orientalism, the construction of Jews, Christians, and Muslims in 19th century American evangelical piety. Welcome, Professor Grafton. And we also are very fortunate to have with us Professor Shabana Mir, who holds a PhD in Education Policy Studies. She is Associate Professor of Anthropology and the Director of Undergraduate Studies at American Islamic College, where she teaches Islamic Studies, Gender Studies, Research Methods, Anthropology, Social Sciences, and Muslim American and Muslim World Literature. She is the author of one of my favorite books, the award-winning book, Muslim American Women on Campus, Undergraduate Social Life and Identity, which received the Outstanding Book Award from the National Association for Ethnic Studies and the Critics' Choice Award from the American Educational Studies Association. She's also the recipient of the Outstanding Dissertation Award for her doctoral dissertation from the American Anthropological Association's Council on Anthropology and Education. And she brings us fluency in English, Urdu, and Punjabi with some Arabic and Farsi mixed in, and is taught in the United States, United Kingdom, and Pakistan. So welcome, Dr. Mir. We are in the midst, in the presence of three people who have very deep experience in the Muslim community, certainly through their publications, and perhaps even more importantly for our purposes today, in training leaders for American leadership among Muslim communities. And so I thought where we would begin today is to ask each of you to offer some opening remarks about your particular organizations and what kind of training you're doing, how that has perhaps changed over time, what populations your programs serve, and how understandings of Islamic leadership in the United States are changing today, even as your student populations are also changing. And I'd like to begin by inviting Dr. Abdullah to start us off.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I want to express my gratitude to the Boise Center for organizing this and for inviting all of us to this remarkable discussion. It's much needed and it's timely, especially as we're seeing our nation shift and change. The reality is that oftentimes other older populations, vulnerable populations have a hard time adjusting. And I think a discussion like this is important that hopefully some insight will be gained. But I want to start by talking about the legacy of religious studies at Temple University itself. As many of you may know, it has a long history of Islamic studies, beginning with Dr. Ismail al-Faruqi, who established the Islamic Studies program there. Our department was established in 1961, but Ismail al-Faruqi, this Palestinian American philosopher, came to Temple University in 1968 and established the Islamic Studies program there. He kind of made his own transition and adjustment from Arabism to what one might call Islamism, right? He was this profound Arab nationalist, as it were, but this made the transition as he was exposed, especially in the United States, to all sorts of Muslims, right? A kind of Islamic diversity, as it were. And that's helped to convince him that, yeah, maybe the Arabism might not work for all these populations, right? And so he made the adjustment, right? So our department has a mission that's built upon the great scholar Max Mueller, who said, if you know only one religion, you don't know any. And so our department is about religious diversity. And so for me, personally, as a scholar, moving from Rutgers University at the Newark campus to Temple University was an amazing education for me because it forced me to actually understand deeper other religious traditions, which allowed me to understand my own much more intimately. It gave me a way to contrast. It gave me something to compare. And so this is a part of the mission at Temple University to sort of establish that kind of interreligious engagement and knowledge, not just engagement, but also understanding and knowledge. Faruqi was also a founder of the IIIT, which is the International Institute of Islamic Thought. He published and authored over 100 articles and 25 books. He also established the Islamic Studies Group at the AAR, or the American Academy of Religion. At one point at Temple University, he had recruited almost single-handedly the graduate students in the amount of 70. I mean, we haven't reached that yet. When I say 70, I mean 70 graduate students from around the so-called Muslim world, who are all majoring in some aspect of Islamic studies. So not just 70 in our total department majoring in various religious topics, but 70 Muslim students studying Islamic studies. We haven't reached that since, to my knowledge, since. I mean, that's quite an achievement. This is during the 1970s when most of this is happening. But also he was able to, I think maybe more importantly, he was able to secure funding and finance for these students from their respective countries. And so that was huge. We understand this in the age of trying to get funding. So that was quite an achievement. So I'll just kind of end here because I know we all have to sort of chime in, and I'm looking forward to hearing my co-panelists as well. But the other part that I think is unique about religious studies and Islamic studies at Temple is that it sort of appropriates the scientific and humanities approach, right? And that means that rather than just studying Islam by rote or memorization, it actually wants to observe what Islamic facts are, right? And to make sure that those facts are open to everyone for investigation, right? So that's key. And this is about the scientific approach. The other part is, of course, that we must have a critical analysis of material, again, as I mentioned just recently, beyond the memorization task. But the other part is that we must explain Islam and not consider it a given. I think some of the drawback for how we train the next generation is that we don't examine what we mean by Islam, right? We don't interrogate the boundaries. What are we talking about when we say Islam? I mean, we have over 100 nationalities among Muslims in America, and we all assume we mean the same thing when we say Islam, right? And so that's important, and not to just propagate or to describe. And I think this distinguishes the Islamic Studies program at Temple from, let's say, maybe a theological program somewhere else. That's not to say that theological schools and seminaries do not engage in critical analysis, but oftentimes it's about propagation. Oftentimes it's about retaining a certain tradition. In this sense, our job is to interrogate what we think we know about our traditions. Right? And I think I'll pause there and let my colleagues chime in. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to pass to David next to talk to us about the program at Hartford Seminary.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation from the Boise Center to participate in this. It's great, and I'm delighted, and it's a privilege to speak on a panel with Dr. Zain Abdullah, a good colleague from Temple University, a place I know well from my Philly days, and just a shout out to him who he just edited a recent edition of the Muslim World Journal, Black Muslim Portraiture in the Modern Atlantic, fantastic edition. So we're just delighted. That kudos to you. So that's wonderful. And certainly it's great to be on the panel with Dr. Shabana Mir from that great city of Chicago. So thank you, everyone. Right. So I want to talk today about Hartford Seminary and the role that Hartford Seminary has played in the field of Islamic studies and training Muslim leaders. It's an interesting place. Now, as a Christian dean at an historically Christian seminary that started in 1834 as a breakaway from Yale because Yale was too liberal, we have these Calvinist roots that now we find ourselves as a very unique seminary, an interreligious seminary that's training. One of our most important programs is training Muslim chaplains. So I want to talk about the distinct changes over our history regarding Islamic studies. So we can think about 5 distinct moments in the history of Hartford Seminary regarding the study of Islam and the development of Muslim religious leaders. So I'm going to mention these 5 different moments and then come back to them. So the first stage, or the first moment from its very beginning, was a traditional 19th century Protestant Christian missionary perspective in teaching about Islam. The second was the discovery of a dialogue with Islam. Then the third was the teaching of Islam and Islamic studies by and with Muslims. The fourth was the professional training of spiritual caregivers for Muslims as chaplains. And then the last moment, which we're in right now, is the professional training of spiritual caregivers as Muslims. So let me go through this and describe these. So from its very earliest days, Hartford Seminary was involved in the teaching and preparation of Protestant missionaries to be sent abroad to Muslim majority nations. And following the International Edinburgh Missionary Conference in 1910, which was in part organized by the president of Hartford Seminary, it opened the Kennedy School of Missions. And so it was through its Muslim department that it trained Protestant missionaries who went abroad, primarily India and to the Ottoman Empire. And it was during this period, of course, that we have to talk about the Professor Duncan Black MacDonald, who originally was hired to come and teach Hebrew, but began teaching Arabic. He was a classical Arabist, and Islam, as he called it, from within, as he would say. That is, trying to help missionaries understand Muslims sympathetically. And he's been renowned as a Western Islamicist and Arabist. Nevertheless, for most of its history, the seminary taught about Islam. And then from the 1950s to the 1970s, there were a succession of former missionaries, including Kenneth Cragg and Willem Bielefeld, who were also editors of the Journal of the Muslim World, who began to introduce ideas about dialogue with Islam. And this was in keeping with a broader shift in thinking among progressive Christian Protestants and Catholics about dialogue. However, it was still a Protestant Christian dialogue with Islam. It was in the 1980s that Professor David Kerr came to the seminary and began to argue that to dialogue with Islam, one needed not only to dialogue with Muslims, to invite them to dialogue, but one needed to learn from Muslims and specifically Muslim faculty members, to have Muslim faculty members on staff, on faculty. And this ultimately led to the hiring of the first Muslim faculty member at any Christian seminary in North America in 1991, Ibrahim Abu Rabi. And he would go on to become the co-director of the McDonald Center. It was in a wonderful era for the McDonald Center for the seminary in the 90s. It was due to his extensive contacts that he took Muslim students and Christian students around the world to meet and dialogue and visit places. And the seminary's reputation among Muslim communities around the world became quite strong, especially in Indonesia. So this was a dialogue by and with Muslims. And unfortunately, his untimely death in 2008 was a shock to many and impacted the institution even to today. The fourth moment came in 2001 when another Muslim faculty member, Ingrid Mattson, former president of this ISNA, created and directed the first accredited Islamic chaplaincy program in the United States. The program was intended to build on the resources of the seminary, not just to learn about Islam or Muslims, but for Muslims to develop skills in spiritual caregiving as Islamic chaplains, which in 2001 was a relatively new concept. The program was not intended to train imams, and while some Muslim students did go on for further academic study and do PhD work, most started coming to the seminary to train as chaplains to serve particular institutions, hospitals, prisons, the military, and most prominently, colleges and universities. It's in this area that Hartford Seminary really was so successful, and many of the prominent universities and colleges across North America are served by Muslim chaplains who are graduates of Hartford Seminary's Islamic chaplaincy program. In 20 years, this program trained Muslim chaplains who have gone on to be spiritual caregivers and leaders all across the country and the world. And their public presence, and this is what's important, their public presence in spaces began to breed a new generation of younger Muslims who saw themselves doing the same kinds of things and being public leaders and spiritual caregivers in public settings, not just in their own communities. And so we've seen them coming to the seminary. And this is the last stage that we're currently in now, and that is the developing of Muslim spiritual caregivers as Muslims. We're now beginning a new degree, a professional Master of Arts in Chaplaincy, which is built upon chaplaincy competencies for professional chaplains, board certified chaplains. And so this master's degree continues an Islamic chaplaincy specialization led by my colleague Bilal Ansari, and a new field education office led by Chaplain Ida Mansour is one of our previous graduates. So it's exciting to think about how in this moment, there are Muslims being trained as professional chaplains to participate in this profession at the highest levels as professional chaplains who bring their own beliefs and traditions and insights and abilities into public spaces. And they will go on to serve a new generation of religious leaders. So one final item that I'd like to mention before I close, which I think is germane to the whole conversation, and that is that we've seen some of our current students and recent grads, Muslims go into take leadership roles in providing leadership in Muslim third spaces outside of traditional Muslim communities. And I think this reflects an ongoing and broader trend in traditional religious communities in North America overall, where there's a new generation of Muslim spiritual caregivers, but also in Christian communities, we see the same thing, that perhaps they're not trained in classical or traditional methods, but they are definitely adept at swimming in our contemporary culture and society and using that to provide spiritual care in a very public multi-faith nation. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was a very helpful, broad overview of the development of the chaplaincy program in particular. I'd like to invite Shabana to talk about American Islamic College.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's just delightful to hear these wonderful presentations and to engage in this conversation, which I hope will be one of many. And thank you to the Boise Center for inviting me. I'm just, it just forced me to think about the work we're doing in a broader context. As you introduced me, I am associate professor at American Islamic College, which has been around since the 1980s, but has gone through several stages. And we have on our website, aicusa.edu, you can follow a little bit more of that history. I don't really want to go into a lot of detail for it, but I'm also director of undergraduate studies at this college. You can also look up a little bit of our mission. And as you can see from our mission, we are really interested in being an exemplary liberal arts college that is also Muslim. We're not a seminary. And we are not a sort of one of those, I really liked how Dr. Abdullah described this, the sort of teaching Islam as a given. What we try to do is we try to incorporate standard academic practice and standard critical academic practice in the teaching of Islam within a faithful space. So that's the really important part of our identity. We are American and we are Islamic. And we also operate within a global perspective. And we really value these things about us. So we are teaching future leaders. We're teaching people who are interested in Islam. We're teaching people who are interested in exploring the Islamic tradition in all its diversity. So for example, one of the things that we pride ourselves on is our academic freedom. So no matter what you're teaching, no matter what your faculty is teaching what, they have full academic freedom to teach whatever. One of the examples I would take is I teach a course on Islam and gender, and it's attracted a number of people from outside, from the community, from non-Muslims, to explore what is happening on a day-to-day basis in contemporary times in the field of gender. So we have full sort of, full academic freedom to teach this. A few of the other things about us is we're very relationship centered. We have at this time, we have a fairly small student body, and we are very focused on individual one-on-one attention. We really want to think of education as being transformative. So the classroom space is a space where you bring everything you are, and we train you. We give you a toolkit and a map for you to make your way. And we don't enforce an interpretation. We don't force an orientation in Islam, but you take the map and you take the toolkit and you take it where you want to go. We're also, while most of our faculty and administration tend to be on the Sunni side, we don't actually have a denomination or sect that we identify with, and we're very focused on being this very radical inclusivity and a multi-denominational approach when speaking about Islam and Muslims. So I really, this is one of the things that I've really valued since I've been teaching at American Islamic College. I arrived here in 2015. as somebody who had taught at mainstream public and private universities and hadn't really seen herself, especially as a woman, teaching in a Muslim college. And I was won over, really. And my first semester, I taught Islam and gender, and you can just imagine, as somebody who identifies as a Muslim feminist, you can imagine how nervous I was. And it was just a delight. Right. This is not to say that there were not multiple interpretations and multiple perspectives in my class, and that actually made it more interesting. And every semester, it's been sort of this ongoing exploration with my students that we do. And so they explore the full diversity of Islamic thought and practice. In any given class, you could have very traditional students, very liberal students, and we do the work together. The other one thing that I find very exciting about that is because it's a Muslim space, we can do more work together. Where very often my colleagues who are in Islamic studies say that when they're in a majority non-Muslim class, the presence of the non-Muslim and the Orientalist gaze, the stereotyping gaze, makes it very difficult for Muslim students to actually do that kind of creative and critical work, because you first have to basically establish the humanity of Muslims and that kind of thing, right? So we can, when we, for example, are talking about race, right? We can do really critical work, and we can really direct the critical gaze at some of the damaging practices that we see in a lot of Islamic jurisprudence regarding slavery and racism, right? So we can really do a lot of that work and really sort of be very creative and very critical in those spaces. And I find that extremely exciting. Very often I will invite specialists, and I'm looking forward, Dr. Abdullah, Sunday, to invite you to my class as a guest speaker. And whenever people will come to my class, they just get very rejuvenated by the possibility of speaking to Muslim students who are very educated and very mature and very interested in sort of this, this internal critique as well as this internal construction, right, of sort of your religious practice. So in terms of thinking about our student base, this is our sort of our main faculty. And in terms of thinking about our student base, we are an extremely diverse student base. So if you look at, for example, our Bachelor of Arts, basically it looks very similar to any standard academic institution. We're very focused on giving our students the important things that they need in a BA. And that's part of my job, is general education. So the general education liberal arts foundation is extremely important to us. Our student base, you really can't define it racially, in terms of age, in terms of national origin. We are a very diverse college. The only thing that I can say is that we are mostly Muslim student body, but that's not only student. We often have non-Muslim students as well. People will come in to take, for example, a course in gender, for example, which they don't find at their local sort of college, or they want to take a course at American Islamic College and that transfer it back into their masters, for example. So we often have people, just like a couple semesters ago, I had a Catholic monk. I had a monk in my class. Then we often have like PhD students from local universities taking various classes at our college. Some of the things in terms of thinking about our future and the challenges that we're dealing with, for example, gender. Right. So gender and like spiritual abuse, gender abuse. These are the things that we're very, very interested in as a university that has a very values-based. We're not objective about these things at all. We want to end abuse and we really want to fight it. So we have a lot of events that we organize. I personally organize several of them. My own background is in gender and looking at Muslim women. So we're also interested in participating in the project to end anti-Blackness within Muslim communities as well as in the United States. So it is very important to us, these events we hold on a regular basis. We network and partner with people in the community as well as in the neighborhood. Interfaith engagement is extremely important to us. So these are things that we build into our programs, and we're just, really important for us to be a center of thought and a center of activism. So this, for example, this coming week, we have an event on gendered Islamophobia that is in partnership with several organizers that are Muslim and the kind of the work that they're doing. So we want to sort of give them that platform to speak to the community as well. So as you can see, we're very American, very Islamic, and we want to be that space of comfort where people can explore their heritage and just really go out into the community and, make be stewards of a better world. So this is all something that I've been very heartened by since I've worked at American Islamic College, and yeah, so that's pretty much an overview of what we do at American Islamic College. I hope that was helpful. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. That was indeed helpful. I think one of the most exciting things that's coming out of this conversation is the richness and diversity of a very broad Islamic tradition, and the variety of programs that are available it's very exciting to see developing. I know many of these programs were not as developed back when I was a graduate student, so it's exciting to see how the field is developing. As we are, I'd like to ask the panelists to think about challenges and opportunities that they see for your institutions as we are moving forward. And while we're doing that, I'd also like to invite the audience, if you have questions that you would like to put in the Q&A that we'll be able to pose to the panelists once they've responded to that question, I'd be happy to vet those as well. So thinking about challenges and opportunities and what direction you see things going in as we move forward, particularly not only in a post 9/11 era, which has created its own challenges and is always the elephant in the room, but also thinking about some of the challenges that are being created now in the context of COVID-19 and racial unrest. I'd like to open that. Anybody want to start that off?
I guess I'll begin the conversation. I think what's interesting about the ways in which Muslims historically have been thinking about, and also non-Muslims, thinking about what it means to be a Muslim in the world today, it seems to be inherently connected to this mosque structure. And in reality, we find that many Muslims are unmosqued, right? So they're not really attending various mosques. And so what other alternatives have developed? And we do find various think tanks like ISPU, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding in DC. You have advocacy groups, of course, like CARE. You have the Pillars Fund that produces this philanthropic kind of like arm. I mean, so all this has sort of developed over time, and probably pretty recently as well, to sort of give Muslims an alternative to just going through the mosque, right? Or sort of being in conversation with an imam who oftentimes does not understand these kinds of challenges and perhaps will look maybe to a medieval context in order to deal with some of these kind of modern challenges, right? And so I think what's hopeful is the proliferation of these kinds of other platforms like that, political, social, economic, and the like. I think also it's important for Muslims to find a way to partner. And we do find funding agencies like, the Carnegie, we find Ford Foundation and others that are open to providing funding to create new kinds of exchanges between Muslims and others, new kinds of encounters, right? Through the arts, through culture. Professor Mir showed some really wonderful slides about like music and art and all that. I think what happens is, and I find myself getting away from this kind of teaching myself, is moving away from ideology and looking more at art, because through art, you can, people can feel more what you're saying rather than trying to intellectualize it and trying to understand various kinds of orientations. Reminds me of what Maya Angelou would say when she said, people will long forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And art is about feeling. It's about how do you kind of give people this emotional connection to a religious tradition. Islam, I think whether you're in Christianity or a member of these various religious groups, you're there because beyond the ideology. I mean, you're there because you feel a certain way in that space, right? And so I think that's extremely important. In terms of COVID, I think that Muslims are challenged to establish the kind of networks that will give other Muslims accurate information, right? And so how do you set that up? How do you establish these networking that actually will provide that? How do we connect with the elderly populations among Muslims? I find that many masjids are focusing on the youth, right? And the elderly, they have actually a practical example of that during the Hurricane Sandy in this northeast area. They were not able to contact the elderly Muslims in their community. I was just appalled by that. They had no network. They had no way of figuring out, do people need help? Are they trapped in their homes? And so I think that's a huge challenge when it comes to these kinds of health issues that are pandemics. And I think Muslims need to do a better job at connecting to these vulnerable populations and making sure they're being contacted and the like. Let me see the other. Okay, fostering. All right. Now, one more point is how Muslims as well have internalized racism, right? And so you have, oftentimes you find that many of the masjids are ethnically centered, right? And so the encounter, even though you do have some that are very multi-ethnic, but many of them are ethnically centered. And this is not a mystery. Why? Because oftentimes, masjids serve as a place that to help one assimilate, right? It helps you find a kind of familiarity that you might not see when you're out in a larger society, right? And so masjids provide a kind of transitory or kind of they become conduits for immigrants who are able to find something familiar as they transition. The problem with that is that, of course, America is an immigration country, right? Right, and as we all know. And so you can't hide from that level of diversity. In fact, it behooves Muslim immigrants, first generation, second generation immigrants, to sort of be in conversation with other groups, precisely because what you're running away from might find you in terms of anti-Muslim racism and the like, and especially when it comes to African Americans who have a long history of understanding those dynamics, can share insights and sort of help to empower. Now, so there's the one issue that I think we have to remember, that not everyone who attends a mosque is going there because they're religiously concerned, right? And I think we make this assumption. I say to my students that, why do we assume that because someone is wearing a hijab or something, or khimar, that they have the knowledge of the Pope or something about when it comes to Islam, or they're a female mufti, right? But if we see someone with a crucifix, we'll never assume this person has intimate knowledge of Christianity or Catholicism or what have you. So I think what's important is to understand that even religious clothing could be much more than just, or let's say covering, could be much more than what we think it means in terms of one's religious sincerity. It could just be cultural. It could be ancestral. And oftentimes it really is. So how we understand the role of the mosque cannot just be based upon devotional activities and behavior. We have to understand them as also social cultural institutions. Now, and so that will give us a different way to engage. At the same time, it's also about power dynamics and authority and representation. So a kind of Arabo-centric notion of Islam is also about who gets to say what Islam is, right? Who gets to actually distribute an authentic sensibility about what Islam is. But this is just not about a representation, it's also about economics. Because Muslims now are establishing a huge presence when it comes to halal food, eating sort of Islamically prepared food, chaplaincies who actually get jobs at certain prisons or hospitals. Who's the authentic Muslim who's going to be able to say, I know what Islam is about, and I know how to pastor to populations? And I'm saying this because I was a Muslim chaplain for about 7 years in the Department of Corrections in New Jersey and New York City and New York State. And so, so how do you present one's authenticity is also about power, right? The last thing I want to say is that the challenge for many of these Muslims who are establishing masjids and other organizations is to especially understand that the masjid, even though it's a religious institution, is also a non-profit organization. Especially when you can set it up that way and actually get much more benefit for taxes and the like, and faith-based initiatives and that sort of thing. So I think what I find is that many imams don't understand how to transition from maybe how masjids were seen in their countries to understanding how to operate this institution as a nonprofit entity, right? And so that becomes a huge challenge for us too. Thank you.
Thank you. And that actually is, I think, a really important point, is this question of leadership that's been trained in other countries versus leadership that's being trained in the United States. And I wonder, Shabana, if you might also have something to contribute in that regard.
Yeah. I'm just really so excited to hear all the things that Professor Abdullah is saying. You were also talking about, who is an authentic representative, right? What sort of racial, ethnic background, what language conveys sort of the authentic representative, what gender also conveys authentic representative. I once applied for a position that was in religious life at some Ivy League university. And what was interesting to me was like the sort of the board asked me questions about being ordained, and we don't have ordination. And then the other question they had was about me as a woman, right? Because what are there women, right? And this is of course changing. So and the other factor that you pointed out also, it's very much also about race and power, right? Race and power are really key things, and this is an ongoing conversation, and we've been really trying to kind of build on that conversation because it's a long coming, right? It's been a long time coming. Malcolm X talks about this, right? So we have tried to, for example, in a class that I teach on Islam in America, it's changed, right? The way I teach Islam in America has changed. The way I study, even as a scholar, like 10 years ago, what I thought about Islam in America was quite different. I'm happy to confess to that. And it's because what we were taught was quite different. The invisibility in our eyes of sort of the majority of Muslims, which are Black and in many cases multi-generational, was just amazing. And so, for example, in my class on Islam in America, we start with enslaved Muslims here in the Americas, and we talk about sort of the legacy that they leave, and we talk about sort of the their presence here, right? Their spiritual presence as well as their textual presence, and so much more. So we talk about these things, and we also talk about the history of development that was done here by Black Muslims. So for example, I'll have in my class, and this is really great about American Islamic College, that in any class, very often we'll have somebody who is in the Nation of Islam, or was previously in the Nation of Islam, and then went on to, for example, the Warathin Muhammad community, or maybe in the Naqshbandi community, and they'll have a conversation, and people will say, this is what I always thought about your community. What can you tell me? And so there'll be sort of this mutual educational, and it just really just warms my heart that at least some people are sort of learning these things. And the other thing that you pointed out was so dear to my heart: art and music and literature. So for example, I'll have people in my class who are imams, and who are very traditional imams, and will read, for example, Nawal al-Saadawi's Woman at Point Zero, right? So they'll read it, and then they'll say, so we're always telling people Islam is do this, do that. But what does that mean to a woman who is abused, the woman who is thrown out, the woman who has nothing but suffering all her life? What are you going to tell her? Cover your head? Like we don't have the language. So the gaps that are pointed out to them by that experience, by the sort of experience of being in somebody else's, shoes, will teach them how to extend really the humanity of their religious experience, of their religious leadership, right? Because it's not only about what you said about, what do you do, what do you believe, what do you practice. That's not all it is. Robert Orsi has talked about lived religion, which is beyond texts, right? So we really try to do that. We really try to, yes, help students master the texts, but not only that, but to also talk about what those texts mean in everyday life, and how people construct religious lives beyond texts as well. Right. And so when we, for example, here in Chicago, there was a very high profile case of abuse of young girls by a religious leader, and American Islamic College, very often these kind of organizations will try to play it down because dirty laundry, the old argument about dirty laundry. And all of our religious groups have faced these issues, right? Christians, Muslims, Jews, all of us, we have faced these kinds of abuse cases. And in most cases, we don't really want to talk about them because we look bad, right? But the only way that you can be true to your faith is by really taking the bull by the horns, and by saying, I am an ally of the abused, and I will not be silent. So we've tried to do that. We've partnered, for example, with organizations like Heart Women and Girls, who are very focused on sort of sex education, health education for girls, with Justice for Muslims Collective and Vigilant Love Against Islamophobia, sort of looking at the connections between gender and Islamophobia, but also militarism and sort of the global impact of all of these things. So we really try, and what you were talking about really reminded me of how people put Muslims in boxes, right? So we have a little box of text, and you do this, and you look like this, and you dress like this, but religion is so much bigger than any boxes. And that's why we have these third spaces developing, because the mosques cannot contain us, right? And in most cases, they only have the people who already fit into those mosques. And I've warned people that you've got, these beautiful, beautiful mosques, but who's going to be in them, right? We've seen a history of these things, right? And not just Muslims, but before Muslims, many people have seen a history. They're being sold as like boutique homes now, condos. So what are you going to do with these mosques? A mosque is not a building, right? It's so much more. So this is our sort of attempt to sort of deal with these challenges. We would always love to partner with other organizations, other institutions, other individuals who are leading these kinds of this kind of work. It's really just so important to us. Thank you.
Thank you. That actually leads very well to what I hope David might be able to add some comments about the development of the chaplaincy program, and how that interacts with some of the things that Zain and Shabana have been talking about.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you both for your comments on this. It's fascinating. And it's interesting to see how all of this plays out in religious communities in America. There's a lot of similarities, and there's a huge generational shift going on here. This is so fascinating. So the first thing I want to say is Shabana's experience at an Ivy League school about whether she was ordained or not. This, you know, for as our country is made leaps and bounds in trying to be more inclusive, religiously inclusive, culturally inclusive. We have ways to go, but it's interesting. It's still a very Christian-centered structural universe, right? And so even with the military, chaplains who go in the military, you know, they're used to, okay, you know, what denomination are you from and who ordained you? And when I've gotten phone calls from students who've come out of an interview at a hospital for a chaplain position, you know, and they're like, they kept asking if I had a Master of Divinity. Well, I mean, the Master of Divinity is a Christian master's degree, but even that, the Master of Divinity is up for debate among Christians. Do you have to have an MDiv to serve? That's a huge question in Christian communities. So, but that hasn't filtered down, or not down, but that hasn't filtered out into universities, hospitals, federal institutions that are still going by this particular kind of Christian structure. You know, Jewish rabbis faced this as well in the 19th century and the early 20th century. Rabbis came as scholars. They weren't professional clergy. And somewhere along the way, they had to become professional clergy. You know, there was this shift for rabbis. So I don't know where it's going to go, but I do know that we're going to have this uncomfortableness for a little while longer until these structures kind of figure out that Muslims don't get ordained, that Buddhists don't have the same kind of structures, you know, that it's going to take a while, and that it's going to change when we get people of different religious traditions into positions of leadership that get it. You know, the second thing I want to say has to do with the third spaces, which is so interesting. I think it's just so American, this whole thing that when people, especially young people, and maybe to go back to Zain's comment about the elderly, maybe the elderly are figuring this out in their own ways, that when the mosque or the synagogue or the church isn't doing what they need it to do, it's not being what they need it to be, it's not answering their questions, they'll make their own. They'll go find their own place. They'll find like people to deal with those questions and struggle with those things, and then act on their particular beliefs and values. And if it's one thing that this crisis has done for us, is it's allowed those spaces to just take off, because now it's become, you know, it's become normal. It's normal to be on Zoom, and you can find like-minded people on Zoom, social media, you know, all that is making that, and that's really exciting. So I think I'll stop.
That's an interesting point with respect to Zoom, of all things, and certainly social media. Although I do wonder the degree to which certain populations that are already marginalized might be even more marginalized by not having access to that. So I think that remains an important question to keep in the mix as we're dealing with generational divides, and particularly concern for the elderly and vulnerable populations. I do see that we had a question that came in from the audience about wanting to understand a little better the ideas and context involved regarding an anti-Blackness event relating to Islamic or Muslim awareness. I wonder if any of you would like to take that question.
Okay, can you repeat that question, please?
Sure, it says, I'd like to understand the ideas and context involved regarding an anti-Blackness event relating to Islamic or Muslim awareness.
I think I was talking about anti-blackness. We deal with these things in the Muslim community, right? We deal with it generally in the United States, and very often we try to sort of hide it by saying, well, I don't see color, or everything is fine, everybody is equal, right? But we try to face it, right? And we try to sort of have events that recognize what sort of practices, what sort of actions reflect an anti-blackness, and how you can change this, right? So we bring in people who can speak to that. So we've had, for example, I showed some flyers that we had that spoke to, for example, race in the Muslim community in Chicago. So we had that event along with WB's, sort of the radio WBZ Curious City, and that was a really good sort of workshop. So we brought in a number of people, and they had conversations around these issues about how Black Muslims are marginalized, and how we can change this. Right. So those sorts of conversations are really important to us. Also, we had some poetry readings. We've had a number of poetry readings and other arts related events that are not only about dealing with the anti-Blackness, but also sort of making more visible the diversity within our community. So those are some of the things that I want to actually, if I might just add one more thing. You were talking about Zoom, and this is really an issue that's really dear to my heart, important to me, is the issue of disability. And I feel that, and I'm very involved with those conversations online, and when many people have said that Zoom has actually allowed more participation by people with disabilities, and by people who have a number of impediments that don't allow them to participate in person events. For me personally, I'm a 2-time cancer survivor. There are a lot of things that I can't, even though I'm mobile and I don't have sort of visible disabilities, but the Zoom events have made it so much easier for me, and I can't imagine how much more of a difference it would make to people who have more severe disabilities. So that's just one more thing I wanted to add.
Mm. And if I could just also speak to that just a bit, I think this engagement around anti-Blackness goes both ways. I think, on the one hand, I mean, you have people now. What's happening now is where certain some either white American Muslim scholars or just white American scholars who are involved in Islamic teachings feel as though they cannot talk about anti-Blackness because they're not Black, right? And so I just had a great conversation with my colleague about her feeling devastated because she was bombarded, because she's white American, and she was bombarded that people just chastised her for speaking about anti-Blackness because she wasn't Black. And I think that's just ridiculous. I think that oppression is oppression, right? And so we know that it definitely is an Islamic value. One, diversity, which the Quran talks about, right? Diversity as providence, that's God ordained, so to speak, right? And then you have the idea about fighting oppression and fighting injustice. It's constantly a constant theme in the Quran. So it's not just about having an event around it, but it's also just being engaged in activities, in protest, or what have you. So people should feel comfortable that they can also join an effort like that in all kinds of ways. And so I just want to sort of slip in here. The challenge of more educated and a professional class among women is challenging these all patriarchal notions of who runs a masjid, who runs an organization, but also the LGBTQIA plus communities, right? And so this is important too. I think oftentimes we actually ignore the fact that this is a rising population who also are claiming an Islamic identity. And so I think these two are major challenges for very conservative Muslim populations.
Can I add something really quickly?
Sure.
So just one of the great opportunities we have here is the diversity of Muslims in the United States, and how having Muslims of different traditions like meet each other and like work it out, represent what is the correct Islam, right? So just last night, our students, we were reading Farid Isak's The Quran, Liberation and Pluralism, right? So there's an African-American Muslim woman, and there's several males from particular regions, Muslim majority countries, right? So she gets it. She understands Farid Ishaq's focus on oppression and what to do about oppression. You know, it speaks to her. And the others are like, well, we're not so talk about the conversation there, right? And so those opportunities here for Black Muslims to begin talking about issues from the Black Muslim perspective and offer that up is, especially in Philadelphia, is so important for not only, I mean, for certainly white Christians to listen to, but also for Muslims from Muslim majority countries and other particular backgrounds, especially white Muslims.
Thank you so much. I can't believe that entire hour went by so quickly. But thank you for sharing the richness of your work and really highlighting the diversity of the populations that we are talking about, and especially for highlighting the importance of what it means to embody the faith, and that we can't just look at texts and books, but we also need to look at real people and where these real people live in their communities. So thanks to our audience as well for some excellent questions. And thank you very much for your attention, and we really appreciate your participation. Have a wonderful evening. Take care.